The Los Angeles airport pulsed with its usual symphony of motion conversations, weaving into the low rumble of rolling suitcases, boarding calls echoing through the terminals like distant thunder. Amid this orchestrated chaos, a man stood alone in the first-class line, not just waiting, but exiting with a calm so profound it seemed to silence the air around him. That man was Johnny Depp. He wore no luxury brand, no designer shoes to broadcast his identity. Just a flannel shirt softened by age, jeans faded by time, and boots worn by stories only he knew. A well-traveled backpack clung to one shoulder, hinting at a life lived without vanity. There was nothing outwardly striking about him except the way stillness wrapped around him like armor. He stood, not to impress, but simply to be. Like, subscribe, share, and comment if this story moved you. People rushed past him, drawn by their own sense of urgency, unaware of the quiet gravity he carried. But not everyone missed him. A man several spots back in the line noticed and sneered. Victor Harding was everything Johnny was not. Draped in an immaculate navy suit, his cufflinks gleamed like status badges. His hair was slicked with precision. His shoes shined to perfection. Everything about him screamed curated success. And when his gaze landed on Johnny, dressed in what could be mistaken for thrift shop apparel, Victor's mouth curled into an arrogant smirk. "First class, huh?" he muttered with theatrical disbelief as he stepped closer, his voice coated in condescension. "You never know who might show up these days." Johnny turned his head with calm precision, catching Victor's gaze without a flicker of emotion. "Yeah," he replied, his voice as even and natural as the sea. "The world is full of surprises." Victor blinked, caught off guard by the lack of defensiveness. He had expected a stammer, maybe an apology or at the very least, a trace of discomfort. But Johnny's unflinching demeanor offered none of that. If anything, it unsettled Victor more. He pushed forward again, emboldened by his own discomfort. "No offense," he said with a smug chuckle, "but you don't look like the kind of guy who flies first class." Johnny's response was a smile, small, sincere, and impervious to insult. "Maybe that's the point," he said gently. Just then, the gate attendant called for boarding. The first-class line stirred forward. Victor adjusted his tie with practiced grace, while Johnny tucked his boarding pass into his shirt pocket, moving forward with an unhurried step. But fate, as it often does in the most unexpected of ways, had plans neither man could foresee. As the two men stepped aboard the aircraft and navigated toward their seats, Victor stopped mid-step and stared in disbelief. There, already settling into the plush leather seat beside his own, was Johnny Depp. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered. Johnny looked up and offered a cordial nod. "Looks like we're traveling together." Victor chuckled bitterly as he took his seat. The discomfort on his face betrayed a man suddenly trapped physically and perhaps spiritually next to someone he had just tried to diminish. Something about Johnny's presence, so calm and unshaken, gnawed at Victor's need to dominate the moment. But what began as an awkward coincidence was about to become something far more profound. As the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway, a quiet hum filled the cabin, the kind of hush reserved for the takeoff of luxury, where champagne replaced plastic cups and tailored uniforms replaced hurried attendants. Outside the windows, the tarmac shimmered under the California sun. Inside, tension simmered in seat 1A. Victor, unaccustomed to being ignored, refused to let the silence linger. He leaned over, feigning curiosity. "So," he said casually, "what do you do for a living?" Johnny looked up from adjusting his bag, his expression mild. "I work in film." Victor raised his eyebrows with theatrical intrigue. "Oh, commercials? Indie stuff?" Johnny smiled. "Something like that." Victor laughed, not from humor, but from a place that needed validation. "I always find it interesting people trying to break into the scene. But let's be honest, some places aren't made for everyone." He gave a pointed glance around first class. Johnny turned slightly, meeting his eyes not with defensiveness but with something gentler, more grounded. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe places are made by the people who choose to walk into them." The words hovered in the air, light yet laced with meaning. Victor shifted in his seat, clearly agitated by Johnny's unwillingness to play the game. He leaned back with forced confidence as the plane lifted off. Once at cruising altitude, the flight attendants began their in-flight service. Champagne flutes sparkled beneath ambient lighting. Victor, with a smirk, ordered, "Your finest glass, please. Let's celebrate life's privileges." When the attendant reached Johnny, his request was simple. "Water, please." Victor turned toward him, incredulous. "Water? In first class?" He laughed, as if Johnny had said something profoundly ridiculous. "You're wasting the experience." Johnny accepted the bottle with a nod. "Sometimes simplicity is enough." Victor scoffed. "That's easy to say when you've never had more." Johnny's eyes met his with quiet gravity. "Or when you've had it all and learned what really matters." Victor fell silent, staring at the untouched champagne in his glass. A few passengers nearby had begun to take notice of the exchange. The subtle tension, the calm restraint, the dynamic unfolding like a quiet storm. Victor, undeterred, pushed again. "Look, I'm not trying to offend you, but let's be real. Some people are meant for the spotlight and some just aren't. That's life." Johnny turned back toward the window, letting the words dissipate. He didn't need to argue, but something inside him stirred, a knowing born from years in an industry that idolized the mask and ignored the man. "You know," he said eventually, voice steady, "what you think people are meant for usually says more about you than them." Victor blinked. "Excuse me?" Johnny turned to him fully this time. "You think I don't belong here because I don't look the part. But belonging isn't defined by appearances, Victor. It's defined by presence, by who you are when no one's looking." Victor laughed, but it faltered on his lips. Something in Johnny's words had found a crack. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. "You talk like some kind of philosopher," Victor muttered, suddenly unsure. "But the world doesn't run on ideas. It runs on results, on power." Johnny's gaze softened, not with pity, but with understanding. "That's what I used to think too." Victor's defenses began to splinter, and then, almost instinctively, his hand drifted to the wedding band on his finger. He twisted it slowly, like a man searching for footing on uncertain ground. "I worked for everything I have," he said, quieter this time. "No one handed it to me." Johnny nodded. "I believe you, but sometimes we build so much trying to prove ourselves, we forget why we started building in the first place." That sentence, more than any before, lodged itself in Victor's chest. He said nothing, staring at the back of the seat in front of him, but the war inside him had begun. He didn't yet realize it, but something in him was shifting, pulled by a stranger who said little, yet revealed everything. The minutes dragged by. Each second weighted heavier than the last. Victor sat rigidly in his seat, posture still proud, but the fire in his eyes had dulled. He looked out the window but saw nothing. His mind churned like a storm on the horizon, full of questions he had spent years avoiding. Johnny remained composed, his attention drifting to a book in his lap. The cover was tattered, its pages marked by years of rereading. It wasn't just a book, it was a companion, something deeply personal. Victor glanced over. "Are you always that calm?" he asked abruptly, more out of need than curiosity. Johnny lifted his gaze slowly, closed the book, and nodded. "Most storms aren't worth chasing, especially the ones people carry inside." Victor blinked, caught off guard again by how easily Johnny dismantled the armor he'd spent years forging. "There's a difference between being calm and being passive," Victor said defensively. "Sometimes you have to fight, scrape, win." Johnny leaned back. "Sure, but not every battle needs a winner. Some just need someone to stop swinging." Victor stared at him, jaw clenched. "You think I swing too hard." "I think," Johnny said, pausing with weight, "you're tired of fighting. You just don't know how to stop." The words dropped like stones in a still pond. Victor's expression faltered. A crack, a flicker of something raw. Behind the polished surface of confidence, there was a man battling shadows no one could see. He took a shaky breath. "You're wrong. I'm not tired. I just don't trust people." Johnny nodded gently. "That's fair. But mistrust is like a mirror. You hold it up to everyone and all you see is yourself." Victor chuckled dryly. "You know, you sound like someone who's lived 1,000 lives." Johnny's smile carried a weight only those who've lost and rebuilt themselves could understand. "Maybe I have." The overhead lights dimmed slightly as the cabin prepared for dinner service. The ambient glow settled over the passengers like a soft veil. But between seats 1A and 1B, the mood was anything but light. Victor glanced at Johnny again, this time with curiosity not born from arrogance but genuine wonder. "You said you worked in film," he began cautiously. "Ever do anything I'd recognize?" Johnny hesitated, a pause that said more than an answer. Before he could reply, a flight attendant approached their row. She leaned in toward Johnny with a warm, respectful smile. "Mr. Depp," she said gently, "the captain asked me to let you know your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his regards." The name rippled through the cabin like a stone tossed into still water. Victor's eyes widened. He stared at Johnny as though seeing him for the first time. "Johnny Depp?" he whispered. Johnny nodded politely, offering the attendant a quiet thanks. Victor froze. The realization struck like thunder. "You're that Johnny Depp?" Johnny turned to him with a calm expression. "Is something wrong, Victor?" Victor's words caught in his throat. "I didn't know. I mean, you didn't say, I didn't think it mattered." Victor's entire demeanor collapsed. The superiority, the smirks, the endless need to establish dominance vanished in an instant, crumbled under the weight of his own assumptions. "But why didn't you say anything?" he asked, dazed. "Because people shouldn't have to be famous to deserve respect," Johnny said, his voice now tinged with gravity. "The truth of who we are isn't measured by who knows our name, but by how we treat strangers." Victor sat back, his eyes glassy. Around them, the cabin had gone still. A few passengers leaned subtly in their seats, listening, absorbing. Johnny continued, his voice now the calm center of a storm that had unraveled a man. "You judged me the moment you saw me, based on my clothes, my demeanor, because I didn't meet your standard of what first class should look like. But people don't have to wear their worth on their sleeves." Victor opened his mouth, but no words came out. Johnny leaned in slightly, soft but unflinching. "It's not about who I am. It's about who you chose to be when you thought I was nobody." Victor looked away. His reflection in the glossy window felt foreign. He didn't see a successful executive or a first-class passenger anymore. He saw something else, something smaller, a man unsure of the person he'd become. He started, his voice hollow. "I was just trying to protect my space, my world." Johnny studied him for a moment before responding. "The higher you build walls around your world, Victor, the more you cut yourself off from what could heal it." Victor stared at his hands. For the first time in a long time, he had nothing to say. The air in the cabin had shifted. It wasn't the change in altitude or the subtle cabin pressure. It was something more intimate. The passengers who once sipped champagne in detached silence now cast thoughtful glances toward the quiet conversation unfolding between two very different men. What they witnessed wasn't confrontation anymore. It was revelation. Victor leaned back into his seat, as though the weight of his past had suddenly landed on his shoulders. The noise of the engines faded into the background. In his mind, everything Johnny had said replayed like a haunting refrain. "I judged you," he finally said, the words gravel in his throat. "Not just you. I think I do that with everyone. My employees, my wife, strangers. I don't know how not to." Johnny didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, allowing Victor to sit with the discomfort that, perhaps for the first time, he wasn't trying to deflect. "You know," Johnny said eventually, "I've met a lot of people who confuse control with purpose. They think if they can just manage every outcome, measure every move, then they'll finally feel safe, but life doesn't work that way." Victor's voice was barely a whisper. "I used to be kind, I think." Johnny turned to him, his gaze steady. "What changed?" Victor shook his head slowly. "Success, maybe, or fear, or both. I spent so long building this version of myself This man who couldn't be challenged, couldn't be weak, that I forgot who I used to be. I don't even remember what I wanted when I started. All I know is I'm exhausted." The words carried a weight no job title could lift. Johnny's voice softened. "Then maybe it's time to stop climbing and start asking why you climbed so far in the first place." Victor closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. "I thought being powerful would make me feel secure, that if I just got the car, the corner office, the status, I'd stop feeling like I was never enough." Johnny's response was a whisper, as if confiding a secret. "That's the great illusion, isn't it? That the noise outside can fill the silence inside?" Victor swallowed hard. "You said something earlier that people shout about their achievements to hide their fears. I think you're right. I've been shouting for years." And now, he had gone silent. The mask he had worn, crafted over decades, was beginning to slip, and what lay beneath it was raw, fragile, human. Johnny didn't press. He didn't gloat or moralize. He simply allowed the man beside him to be vulnerable, without judgment. That, more than anything, was what broke Victor's final defense. He looked at Johnny not as a celebrity, not as a symbol of quiet wisdom, but as a man who had seen the world, been broken by it, and yet somehow chose grace over cynicism. "I owe you an apology," Victor said, looking down at his hands again. "Not because you're famous, but because I forgot how to be a decent person." Johnny gave a soft nod. "The apology isn't for me. It's for yourself. You've been carrying a version of you that no longer serves you. Let it go." Outside the window, stars began to dot the darkening sky. The vast, infinite stretch of night framed the cabin in a kind of sacred hush, as if the universe itself had paused to listen. Victor exhaled. His fingers stopped fiddling with the wedding ring. His eyes no longer darted around looking for escape. He sat still, not with pride, but with peace. The flight attendant returned, gently setting a new glass of champagne in front of Victor. He looked at it for a moment, then turned to Johnny. "You know what?" he said with a half-smile, the first genuine one of the flight. "I think I'll have water." Johnny grinned. The attendant, slightly confused, retrieved the glass. A small ripple of approval spread among the first-class passengers. The arrogance that had once filled Seat 1B was gone, replaced by something rare in a space designed to separate humility. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice filled the cabin, but Victor barely heard it. He was somewhere else, entirely inward, for the first time in years. The descent wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. A return to something honest, something real. The aircraft began its slow descent into Tokyo, city lights below stretching like a tapestry of fireflies across the dark earth. Inside the cabin, seatbelts clicked and seats returned to upright positions, but in one row near the front, something far more profound had shifted than posture. Victor stared out the window, the cityscape glimmering beneath him, and felt something unfamiliar blooming quietly inside his chest. Regret, yes, but also clarity. The silence between him and Johnny was no longer strained. It was comfortable, the kind of quiet that followed catharsis, the kind of quiet born from understanding. For years, Victor had chased significance like a man starved, thinking that power, possessions, and appearances would give him purpose. But now, beside a man who owned none of the airs he once admired, only calm and humility, Victor understood something he never had before. Success means nothing without a soul. The wheels touched down with a smooth thud, the brakes humming as the aircraft slowed. A collective sigh passed through the cabin. Everyone was preparing for the rush of disembarkation, the return to movement, to business, to schedules. But Victor remained seated, still absorbing everything that had unfolded in the clouds. Johnny unbuckled his belt, stretched subtly, and retrieved his backpack. As he stood, Victor did too slowly, thoughtfully. "I owe you something more than an apology," Victor said. His voice, though calm, trembled with the weight of sincerity. "You reminded me what I used to believe in before I got lost." Johnny looked at him and placed a hand on his shoulder. His words were simple, but his eyes carried lifetimes. "Then don't waste that. Go find him, the man you were before the world told you who to be." Victor blinked back the sting in his eyes. "I think I will." They stepped into the aisle together, now side by side in a way that had nothing to do with ticket class or boarding priority. The divide between them had vanished. As they exited into the terminal, a small group of fans spotted Johnny. They approached with excitement but also reverence, quietly requesting photos. Johnny obliged with his signature warmth, never hurried, never performative. He made each of them feel seen. Victor watched in awe. It wasn't the celebrity that moved him, it was humanity. How someone so revered could be so grounded. It struck him that Johnny's fame had never been the source of his strength. It was his humility that made him larger than life. After the fans dispersed, Johnny turned back to Victor one last time. "Take care of yourself," he said with a faint, knowing smile. "The real you." Victor nodded, speechless. He watched as Johnny melted into the crowd, not needing to be seen to be remembered. And there, standing amidst the noise and neon of the Tokyo airport, Victor Harding felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. Not the hope that clings to promotions or luxury, but the quiet, earnest hope that change is possible even for those who thought it was too late. He didn't know exactly what he would do next, but he knew he'd call his wife. He'd call his assistant. He'd apologize to people who never got one. He'd breathe without needing to prove he deserved air. And maybe, just maybe, he'd start building a life rooted not in superiority but in sincerity. In life, we often walk past each other wearing masks, judging books by covers, mistaking silence for weakness, simplicity for failure. But every so often, if we're lucky, we encounter someone who reminds us of the truth. That worth isn't worn, it's alive. That presence speaks louder than performance. And that respect should never be earned through status but granted by default, simply because we share this world. Johnny never needed to announce who he was, and that, more than anything, made him unforgettable.